I noticed the change the morning my son-in-law used my Visa card to pay for their car insurance without asking. Not the first time he'd helped himself to something that belonged to me, but that morning, standing in my kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, holding a paper statement I'd almost thrown away without opening, that was the morning something shifted inside me. Not anger, exactly. More like a door closing very quietly in a room I'd left open for too long. My name is June. I'm 67 years old, a retired school librarian, and for the past 2.5 years, I had been living in what used to be my house. I want to say that again because it still sounds strange to me, even now, what used to be my house. I bought that house in 1994 with my late husband, Leonard. We chose it together on a Tuesday afternoon in October when the pecan trees out front were dropping and the air smelled like wood smoke from somewhere down the block. Leonard said the porch alone was worth the asking price. He wasn't wrong. We raised our daughter there. We painted that kitchen 3 times, argued about the color twice, and laughed about it every time we walked past the paint chips still tucked behind the cabinet near the stove. Leonard died 11 years ago. I stayed. It was still my home, and I intended it to stay that way. My daughter Renata is 41. She's smart and warm, and she has her father's way of tilting her head when she's listening to you. She married a man named Brooks 4 years ago, and I genuinely tried, to give him a fair start. He's not a bad man in the obvious way. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't make cruel jokes. He just has a particular way of moving through the world that assumes things will be provided for him, and he has a talent for making that assumption feel like everyone else's natural responsibility. When Renata called 2.5 years ago and said they were having trouble with their apartment lease renewal, that the landlord was raising the rent more than they could absorb right now, I said yes before she finished the sentence. Of course, come stay with me. The house has the room. I'm alone. It made sense. What I didn't fully understand then was the difference between having someone stay with you and having someone move in on you. The first few weeks were fine. Good, even. Renata cooked on Sunday evenings, and we'd eat together at the dining table that had sat mostly quiet since Leonard passed. Brooks was polite in the careful way that someone is polite when they're still performing. He took out the recycling without being asked. He complimented the neighborhood. But households have a way of revealing themselves slowly, like weather. By month 2, Renata had rearranged the pantry in a way that made sense to her and no sense to me, and when I mentioned it, she laughed lightly and said, "Mom, this is so much more efficient." I let it go. She'd grown up in that kitchen. Maybe she knew something I didn't. By month 4, Brooks had claimed the second bathroom as his own without discussion. He left his shaving kit spread across the counter, his products lined up in a row that left no space for anything else. When I mentioned that I occasionally used that bathroom when mine was occupied, he said, "Oh, sure, of course," and didn't move a single thing. By month 6, they had started having friends over on Friday evenings. Not asking, just telling. "A few people are coming over Friday, that okay?" said in the tone of a statement, not a question. The first time it happened, I stayed in the living room and joined in, trying to be welcoming. The second time I retreated to my bedroom because I felt like a guest in my own front room, and I sat there on my bed listening to people I didn't know, laughing in my kitchen, and I thought, this is an unusual feeling. I told myself it was an adjustment. Families do this. They blend and negotiate and find a rhythm. I was patient. I am by nature a patient woman. 31 years as a school librarian will do that to you. You learn to wait. You learn to give people room to grow into better behavior. But some people don't grow into it. They just take the room. The finances started gradually, the way these things always do. Renata mentioned once that they were a little short this month, unexpected car expense. I helped. Brooks's quarterly tax payment, he does freelance accounting work, came in higher than expected. I covered it. Could I add them to my Costco membership? Could I pick up groceries when I went? They'd pay me back. Could I spot them for the utility bill just this once because their accounts were in transition? I told myself these were loans. I kept a small mental ledger. I was careful not to mention it too often because I didn't want to make my daughter feel like a debtor in her mother's house. I wanted her to feel at home. At some point, and I cannot tell you exactly when, The ledger in my head became the only place the debt existed. They stopped mentioning paying me back. I stopped bringing it up, and in the silence between us an understanding settled in that I had not agreed to. It was the Visa card that made me see it clearly. I had given Renata the number once, months before, for a grocery order when my regular card was declined due to a fraud alert. A temporary thing. She'd written a number down somewhere, apparently, because when I opened that statement in my kitchen with the pecan trees tapping against the window in the early spring wind, I saw the car insurance charge, the streaming subscription I'd canceled years ago reinstated under my card, and a charge from a restaurant I'd never been to on a Saturday night when I'd stayed home alone with a book and a bowl of soup. I set the statement on the table. I made coffee. I sat down. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I've always been a crier, good news, bad news, commercials about dogs. But that morning I just sat very still with my coffee and looked at the pecan trees and thought about Leonard the way I often do when I need to think clearly. Leonard was a practical man. He used to say that the kindest thing you can do for someone who's taking advantage of you is to stop letting them. He said it gently, without judgment, like a simple fact about weather or gravity. I thought about that for a long time. The moment I finally understood what had been happening, the full shape of it, wasn't the morning of the statement. It was about 2 weeks earlier. A Thursday evening, my neighbor Constance had invited me to dinner. Constance is 72, a retired nurse, and she makes a jambalaya that Leonard used to say was the single best argument for living in the South. I'd been looking forward to it all week. I'd told Renata and Brooks that I wouldn't be home for dinner. I was backing out of the driveway when Renata came out the front door. She was holding her phone and she had that look she gets, slightly apologetic, slightly hopeful, that I have always found very difficult to resist. She said her coworker was coming over with her husband and they were going to need the dining room table. Could I pick up a few things at the store on my way home? She handed me a list on her phone. Wine, a specific cheese from the deli, flowers if they had good ones. She said it quickly, like she was already assuming yes. I looked at that list. Then I looked at my daughter. I'm going to Constance's for dinner, I said. I know, she said. I meant on your way home. After. The store closes before I'll be back. She looked briefly frustrated, then said, Mom, it's not a big deal. It's just a few things. I drove to Constance's. I had the jambalaya. I did not stop at the store. But I sat at Constance's table that night with a heaviness I couldn't fully shake. Constance noticed. She notices everything. 30 years of nursing will do that, and when I told her some of it, just some, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, June, when's the last time you had your own house to yourself? I didn't have an answer. She said, not a long visit, not an evening, your house, to yourself. When? I drove home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for 15 minutes before going inside. The lights were still on. I could hear their friends' voices through the window. The dining table I'd eaten at with my husband for over 20 years was set with the tablecloth Renata had bought without asking, replacing the one Leonard's mother had made by hand. I went in through the side door. I said goodnight to no one. I went to my room. I did not sleep for a long time. The morning after I found the Visa statement, I called my bank. I was connected to a woman named, well, she said her name, but it doesn't matter. What matters is her voice was steady and professional, and she walked me through every step. I had the card flagged and reissued. I changed the account number. I set up alerts for any charge over $25. Then I called my attorney, a man named Gerald who had handled Leonard's estate and who I had not needed since. I told Gerald the full situation. The finances, the card, the length of time. He asked me careful questions about whose name was on the deed, whether there had been any written agreements, what payments, if any, they had made toward the household. He was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then he said what I already knew but needed to hear from someone else. He said, June, this is your house. You have not signed away any rights to it. You are not legally obligated to provide housing, and you are certainly not obligated to provide financial support. What you are experiencing has a name. It's sometimes called financial enmeshment. And it's more common than you'd think, particularly in multi-generational households. The good news is that you can change this, and you have more authority here than you may feel like you do right now. I wrote that down. Financial enmeshment. It had a name. Something about having a name for it made it slightly more bearable. Gerald advised me to document what I could. I spent the next several evenings quietly going through statements, making copies, writing dates and amounts in a notebook with a yellow cover I bought specifically for this. Over 2 years, the total was not a small number. I won't say the exact figure, but when I wrote it at the bottom of the last page of that notebook, I had to put the pen down and breathe. I want to say something here about my daughter, because I think it matters. Renata is not malicious. I believe that with certainty. She is a woman who slipped gradually into a way of living that her husband shaped, and who told herself the story that her mother was happy to help, because her mother never said clearly that she wasn't. That is a failure of honesty on both sides. I know my part in it. I am a woman who spent 31 years saying, of course, and no trouble at all, and it's fine, really. I taught my daughter that I had no edges, that I was endlessly accommodating, that asking was the same as receiving. That is not Renata's fault entirely. It is not fully mine either. But it was mine to change. I planned for 2 weeks before I said a word to anyone. I contacted my financial advisor, a woman named Barbara who had been managing my retirement account since I was 53, and we had a long conversation about restructuring. I took my name off a joint account I hadn't fully realized I'd been added to at some point. I reviewed my will, which had been sitting unchanged since the year after Leonard died. I made some changes there too. Nothing dramatic. Just accurate. I arranged to have the house to myself for one weekend. I told Renata I was going to visit my college friend in Charleston, which was partially true. I did call her, and she would have had me if I'd asked. But I didn't go. I stayed home. I sat on my porch in the mornings with coffee and no voices and no one else's schedule, and I listened to the neighborhood I had lived in for 30 years. The pecan trees. The dog 2 houses down that barks at exactly 7:15 every morning. The sound of Mr. Okafor's newspaper hitting his porch, which is a sound I have heard almost every day for 15 years. The smell of someone's dryer sheets on the breeze. I had forgotten how much I loved the plain sound of my own life. On Sunday evening, when I knew Renata and Brooks would be home soon, I came back inside. I set the yellow notebook on the kitchen table. I made tea. I waited. When they came in, Brooks went upstairs without looking at me. Renata came into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and said something about whether we had enough eggs. I said her name. She turned around. I said, I need us to sit down. There are some things we should have talked about a long time ago, and I should have started this conversation myself before now. I'm sorry I didn't. She sat down. She saw the notebook. Her face changed. We talked for a long time. I did not raise my voice. I had decided before she walked through the door that I was going to be the woman Leonard always said I was, clear, fair, without cruelty. I laid out what I had found. The card charges, the running total, not as an accusation, but as information, as the shape of something she may not have fully seen herself. She cried. I knew she would. She said she hadn't realized how much it had accumulated. She said Brooks handled most of their finances, that she honestly hadn't known about the card. I looked at her face when she said that, and I believe she was telling me the truth, or a version of it. The version where she hadn't asked too many questions because it was easier not to. I told her I wasn't asking them to leave immediately. I said I loved her, which is true and will always be true and has nothing to do with any of the rest of this. But I told her that the arrangement needed to change and that I was going to need a timeline. 6 months to find their own place. A monthly payment toward the household, in the meantime, a fair and specific amount. The visa situation was already handled. The will situation was already handled. I said all of this quietly, like a woman stating facts she has had time to make peace with. Brooks came down at some point during this conversation. I don't know how long he'd been at the top of the stairs. When he came into the kitchen, he was very quiet. He didn't argue. He poured himself a glass of water, and he sat at the far end of the table, and he looked at his hands. He's not a bad man. I said that before, and I still believe it. He's a man who took the room he was given because no one had yet explained that the room had a door. I was explaining that now. It's been 4 months since that evening. Renata and Brooks found an apartment in Pooler just 20 minutes from the house. They signed the lease 2 months ago, and they're moving in at the end of next month. We've had some hard weeks and some surprisingly easy ones. Renata and I have started having coffee on Saturday mornings, just the two of us at a diner on Waters Avenue that we used to go to when she was in high school, and I would quiz her on vocabulary for her English classes. We talked, really talked, for the first time in longer than I want to admit. She told me things about the last few years that I hadn't known. I told her things too. Some of it was hard to hear and hard to say, but it was honest. And honesty, I have come to believe, is an act of love even when it doesn't feel like one at the time. The morning after I found the visa statement, before I called the bank, before I called Gerald, before any of it, I went out to the porch with my coffee while it was still early enough that the street was quiet. The sun was just starting to come through the pecan trees sideways, the way it does in April in Savannah, golden and low and long. I sat in the chair that Leonard used to sit in. I looked at the street I had looked at for 30 years. I thought, this is mine. This morning, this porch, this light. I earned this. Not just with money, though, that too. With 31 years of showing up to work every morning, with the years of raising a daughter and loving a husband and painting a kitchen 3 times and staying after Leonard died when it would have been easier to go, with the particular loneliness of getting older in a world that does not often ask how you're doing and mean it. I had given freely because I wanted to. That part I do not regret. But somewhere along the way, giving had stopped being a choice and started being an expectation. And the difference between those two things is the whole world. Dignity, I've decided, is not something you fight for loudly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require an audience. It's a quiet thing. It looks like sitting on your own porch in the early morning while the pecan trees catch the light and the coffee goes warm in your hands. And the only voice you have to listen to is the one inside you, finally telling you the truth. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that April morning on my porch, not in any grand or formal way, just the quiet kind of thinking that comes when you finally have enough silence to hear yourself. What happened in my house over those 2.5 years didn't begin with a stolen credit card number. It began much earlier with a pattern I had helped create without fully understanding what I was doing. Every time I said of course when I meant I'm not sure, every time I absorbed a cost without naming it, every time I smoothed over a friction that deserved to stay rough a little longer. Those weren't generous acts in isolation. Stacked together over months and years, they became a set of instructions I had handed to the people living under my roof. Instructions that said, there are no limits here. Instructions that said, I will not tell you when you've gone too far. Renata didn't wake up one morning and decide to take advantage of her mother. Brooks didn't arrive with a plan. What happened was slower and quieter than that, and in some ways harder to see because of it. They moved into the space I kept opening up. That's what people do, and I don't say that to excuse it. I say it because understanding how something happens is not the same as accepting that it should have. The tricky thing about kindness, real kindness, the kind that costs you something, is that it requires honesty to stay healthy. Kindness without honesty curdles eventually. It starts to look like generosity from the outside and feel like resentment from the inside. I know, because I lived in that feeling for longer than I should have. What I did the morning I sat with that bank statement and made my calls. That took a different kind of courage than I was used to. I had courage in ordinary measures. I'd raised a daughter. I buried a husband. I'd gone back to work at 58 after 2 years of grief and learned a whole new cataloging system and didn't complain about it once. That's the endurance kind of courage, the kind that gets you through. But the courage to speak up inside your own home, to the people you love, about something that has quietly been diminishing you. That's different. That requires you to believe that your own comfort matters, that your boundaries are not inconveniences to be apologized for. That saying this is not working for me is not an act of cruelty, but an act of clarity, and that clarity, offered with steadiness and without malice, is one of the more loving things one person can offer another. I am 67 years old, and I am still learning this. Constance asked me when I'd last had my house to myself. That question did more for me than a year of keeping the peace had done, because it forced me to see what I had been pretending not to notice. And once you see something clearly, you are responsible for what you do with that seeing. I chose to act. Not loudly, not cruelly, but firmly. And the relationship I have with my daughter now, coffee on Saturday mornings, honest conversation, the particular ease of two people who have stopped pretending, is better than anything we had in those 2.5 years of careful silence. What you allow continues. What you name, you can change. And it is never, in my experience, too late to decide that you deserve the life you built.